if you remember, started as the church and state from the time of Constantine in the 4th century. And this fourth talk is the origin and progress of separatism. The origin and progress of separatism. So I have 4 points here. First of all, the origin of separatism. Secondly, developments in England. Thirdly, developments in Wales. And then developments in the American colonies. And finally, and most importantly, the importance of separatism. So the origin, this is going back. As I've outlined earlier, basically groups emerged from the 4th century Constantine church which claimed to base their practices and teaching on the New Testament church, particularly Acts 2, but other passages too. And these groups are usually referred to as the Pilgrim Church, the most enduring being the Waldensian Church, founded by Peter Waldo in Lyon in France. And this in turn influenced the Anabaptist movement in the 16th century. Their views, both of the Waldensians and others, and of the Anabaptists, on church and state were very clear. Separate, but under the sovereignty of God. Now we see many changes in geography in our modern world, but I just turn you to Acts 17:26, which basically states that God determined the times of nations and also the bounds of their habitation. It appears otherwise, but in fact that is the situation. Our God is sovereign of his church and sovereign of all nations. So what I want to do is outline the separatist movement from a geographical perspective. First of all, developments in England. And basically here, as one person is of supreme importance, but he is not to be confused by a later man. There's 2 Robert Browns that are famous in history. A 19th century Robert Brown was the one who observed the haphazard movement of pollen grains in water under a microscope, and basically attributed that to bombardment of water molecules, and it became to be known as Brownian motion, and it was an important contribution to the kinetic theory of matter. But that's one Robert Brown. But this Robert Brown was a congregational man. He believed in the church being organized in a congregational manner. So this is his representation. He established a denomination which was basically Puritan in ecclesiology. And the interesting thing is that the Brownist movement was a precursor of the Pilgrim Fathers. This development was in East Anglia mainly, but basically later the Pilgrim Fathers had many members who were Brownists. Now, not only Robert Brown himself, but 2 of his important associates were Henry Barrow and John Greenwood, and they had 2 clear views of New Testament ecclesiology, the New Testament church, and they expressed those views very strongly, but they were martyred for their beliefs in the time of Elizabeth I. The second one I want to mention in connection with separatism is Thomas Cartwright. Thomas Cartwright was basically the professor of theology at Cambridge University in the 1570s. And he had clear separatist views, and he had a desire to reorganize the Church of England along Presbyterian lines. That was another aspect to his beliefs. And then the Pilgrim Fathers themselves in 1620 set off in the Mayflower. They were dissenters, and they established a colony at Plymouth, Massachusetts. And it was effectively a theocracy, rather like the theocracy that Geneva established by John Calvin. They were Congregationalists. But I want to say more about the colonies later, because it wasn't just quite as simple as that. Another contribution was a negative one, and this was brought in by the Act of Uniformity. This was brought in by Charles II in 1662, demanding that those in the Church of England who had ministerial status conformed to each of the tenets of the Act of Uniformity. And many hundreds of ministers of Puritan persuasion could not agree with the principles of the Act. And basically, the year later, in 1663, they were ejected from their livings. Now, not all, in fact, left. Not all had the unfortunate situation in front of them. I remember going to visit my nephew in Norwich, and he took me to a church in Suffolk, or a church building, in a little village called Lavenham. And he thought it might be of interest to me. Just the architecture of the small church, a small church building. And surely it was well constructed. And the church building happened to be open. And I walked inside, and there was a board giving a list of the worthy people who had basically ministered at the church. And one name came out from the board to me. That was the name of William Gurnall. Now, William Gurnall wrote a classic, Christian classic, called The Christian in Complete Armour, which is an exposition of Ephesians chapter 6. So, why he was able to sign the Act of Uniformity, I don't know, but certainly he was a worthy man who served the Lord at that little place of Lavenham. But many could not do so, and basically they left the Church of England, and it resulted in the rise of independency. Some became congregational in their views, some Presbyterian, and others Baptists. The Baptists of particular persuasion, because they believed in the doctrine of particular redemption, included John Bunyan and John Gill, who was the theologian of the movement, and also, of course, in the same tradition, Charles Haddon Spurgeon. But there were also General Baptists who had a different view of the atoning work of Christ. So that was the situation in England. But the situation in a sense, in Wales was more interesting. And there were several Puritans, three in particular, who made an important contribution. This was in the first part of the 17th century, in the reigns of James I, Charles I, and also the Commonwealth period, presided over by Oliver Cromwell. Now, unfortunately and sadly, we can't find images of these two people. But the first one was a man called Vavassar Powell. I'll come back to him at the moment. the first part of the 17th century. And another one, Walter Craddock. Craddock was a Cromwellian. They were Puritans, strongly advocating the separation of church and state. And they were supported by a third Puritan called William Roth, who established a separatist church in Wales at a place called Llanfacres. Llanfacres was a village on the outskirts of Newport. He established that in 1641 as the first separatist church that was developed in Wales. Now, it's very interesting, actually, that more than 70 years later, when revival in the 18th century came to Wales, particularly through Rowland and Harris, the older people who had seen the effect of Craddock's ministry declared that the Craddockians have returned. That was just a reflection of the esteem in which Craddock was held. Powell, however, was not appreciated by the 19th century historian Thomas Carlyle. He described him like this: he had the flamy and fuliginous set of doctrines, fuliginous means sooty, superadding Anabaptistry to Sansculottism. Now the last part means simply, it was a reference of the gentry in France to revolutionaries who didn't have fashionable culottes, but instead had the commoner pantaloons. So it was basically a term of abuse, but it referred to revolutionaries. So he was saying basically, this man is a revolutionary, he's an Anabaptist, and he has what Carlyle described as fuliginous, sooty doctrines. But we can look at it more positively and say that basically what he was saying was he observed that this man had a great zeal for the gospel. It was a reflection of his zeal. Now, moving on, the fourth point, the American colonies. Now, we've got to be careful here. Remember that basically in 1492, Columbus established a landing in America. There's various different views on why it was called America, but I think the best one is one of the sister ships, basically of the Santa Maria. The captain was Americo Vespucci. I think that was probably named America after Amerigo. That's just my view anyway. Well, it's not just my view, which several views have that. But America was basically not an entity that we see today in the USA. Independence was declared in 1777, and the war that took place with Britain went on to 83. But even then, that didn't produce a united America. It was only a united country, really, after the Civil War in 1861-65. So what was it then? Who occupied the America of the 17th century? Well, it was occupied by colonists from Britain and other European countries, and also, of course, the native Indian tribes, Apache, Sioux, Comanches, etc. And it suggested that they originally came from Mongolia and crossed the Bering Sea into America. But going back to the British colonies, typified by the Pilgrim Fathers, but basically they went there desiring purity of worship in the church. But the problem with the Pilgrim Fathers and those who followed later was that they were often accompanied by traders who did not have the same religious convictions as the Pilgrim Fathers, or they may have had none at all. But they were part of the communities that were established, and believers covenanted together, and unbelievers were subject to the same covenant demands. This was regarded as the full covenant. Now later, groups that came to America realized the failure of this approach and changed to what was called the halfway covenant, in which unbelievers were subject to only part of the covenant. But in outcome, it was little better. But the contrast came with the Rhode Island community, Rhode Island of Connecticut, in what is called New England. The English settlers there, after the Pilgrim Fathers, included a man called Roger Williams. Have I got Roger Williams? Yeah. There's a statue of him in Providence, Rhode Island. Williams was an unusual character. He was born in London in 1603, the time of the accession of James I. He was educated at Cambridge University, and he was ordained into the Church of England. But then he emigrated to America and ministered as an Anglican in the east coast of America from about 1630. But between 1630 and 1636, he came to separatist and Baptistic views. He had the means to acquire property, and he acquired that property at Providence, Rhode Island. He became pastor in 1636 of the Baptist community in Rhode Island, and he rejected, quite rightly, both the full and halfway covenants. As regards unbelievers, though he sought to evangelize, no pressure was put upon them to agree to any such covenant. It was, in other words, an absolutely free community. Later, Williams became governor of Providence Plantation, and later the newly established state of Rhode Island. He lived a long and influential life, and is considered by many people, including those in the USA, to be the father of American democracy. And the important thing was he advocated the separation of church and state, the reason to preserve the unity of the church. So he was a very important figure in American history. Now, the final point then is, why is separatism so important? Well, basically, there are always problems from Constantine onwards when a church-state separation is not maintained, that is, for Bible-believing Christians. As Williams and the Puritans maintained, the purity of the church, as described in Acts 2, is compromised. Though not unique, and I don't want to be thought to get particularly criticizing the Church of England, we can learn a lot of lessons from the way the Church of England developed from Reformation times, and it shows basically the problems and difficulties caused by not having a church-state separation. First of all, Henry VIII. Now, remember some time ago, the late politician Tony Benn was discussing the question of nationalisation, and he said, well, there's nothing new about nationalisation, because Henry VIII nationalised the Roman Church in England, and basically that was quite near the truth, because although he reduced the power of the ecclesiastical courts, and through Cromwell, that is Thomas Cromwell, not Oliver Cromwell, he started to demolish the monasteries. Well, we can argue about that, and I don't want to get into that particular issue. But the point is that Henry basically remained, I believe, a Catholic unto his deathbed. He allowed the execution of those who refused to accept the real presence in the communion, including a lady, Anne Askew, who was racked and then taken crippled to her death at the stake. But Henry assumed the head of the hierarchy of the church, and that is maintained through the centuries, irrespective of the spiritual state of the person concerned, the monarch concerned. I'll come back to that later. Genuine reforms took place, however, in the reign of Edward VI. Tragically, a very short reign from 1547 to 1553. There were men of the calibre of Cranmer, Hooper and Latimer, basically reformers, but that reformation, in my opinion, did not go far enough. It might well have done had Edward lived a bit longer, but then of course we had the cruel persecution of Mary Tudor, Mary the First. Following that, Elizabeth's reign, she took a middle course. She regarded Puritanism and Romanism as equally unacceptable, and the sort of moderate state of the Church of England is really reflected in the bishops Wycliffe, Grindal and Parker. These men were very much of a moderate persuasion rather than an evangelical persuasion. Then I mentioned the Act of Uniformity and the Great Ejection, where many godly Puritans were lost to the Church of England. Mentioned that before. There was an improvement in the evangelical awakening and the influence of Wesley, Whitfield, Grimshaw and others, and indeed the formation of the Church Missionary Society. So that was a good thing. But by the mid-19th century, the church became influenced by the so-called Oxford movement, which was led by people like Pusey and Newman, who took his views to a logical conclusion in the end by joining the Church of Rome. But Anglo-Catholicism came into the Church of England, despite the 39 articles refuting such a position. And basically, we can say that it became doctrinally comprehensive, accepting all or most shades of opinion. Then the 20th century, the early 20th century, was the rise of ecumenism. Concessions were made to societal changes in the state. There was the abuse scandal that was handled very badly by the church hierarchy. Dr. Lloyd Jones, who was very respected in evangelical churches, called for those in the Church of England to withdraw from the mixed character of the church, but that was largely ignored. And then the contemporary scene is even worse. We see a church vulnerable to further societal changes. Gay priests were tolerated, and same-sex marriage was accepted in many places. There was a failure to condemn LGBT, and more lax abortion laws were accepted. And then, of course, there was a question of women priests. Not only priests, but then become bishop, and ultimately the head of the hierarchy, an archbishop, quite contrary to Paul's teaching in 1 Timothy 2:12, who said that a woman could not have authority over a man in the church. The result of all this is that 39 articles have virtually become a museum piece. The monarch declares himself to be a defender of the faiths, not one faith, but the faiths. Very sympathetic to the teaching of Islam. William has expressed reservations about commitment to the Church of England. So the conclusion from Anglicanism and a wider visible church is that state and its influences are harmful. Separatism is necessary to defend the purity of the church, as William said, reflecting both Puritan and evangelical views. Now, there was one good thing, actually. That was when our brother Philip Leavesley was here. He spoke about the Church of England continuing. Well, that's very encouraging. The 4 congregations, though they're small at the moment, exist. But there's further revival and reformation needed. That is needed to continue. That the original position of the 39 articles might be restored and other aspects. Thanks for listening.